There is a very strange kind of power. You cannot see it, you cannot hear it, yet you always feel it when you are around someone who possesses it. They don't speak much, they don't try to impress, but somehow everything around them seems to adjust on its own. Conversations slow down, people become more careful, and you get the sense that they are in control of the situation, even though they are doing almost nothing. The paradox is most people move in the opposite direction. They believe that to be in control, they must speak more, react faster, express themselves more clearly. They try to explain, to prove, to maintain momentum in every interaction. But in doing so, they quietly place themselves in a reactive position. And the moment you are forced to react, you are no longer in control. You do not lose power when you remain silent. You lose power when you feel that you cannot remain silent. The moment you feel the need to reply instantly to a message, to explain yourself so you won't be misunderstood, to react in order to maintain your image, that is the moment you have already handed over control to someone else. No one is forcing you, yet you are still being pulled in. And the most dangerous part is you think this is normal. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist persists." The more you react to something, the more you push against it, the more it clings to you. This is not only true internally, but also in how you operate within relationships. The more you react to someone, the more you are drawn into their orbit. And Niccolo Machiavelli observed power in a very practical way. Those who maintain their position are not the ones who react to every collision, but the ones who choose very carefully when to engage. Not everything deserves your reaction, and that selectivity is what creates power. If you look closely, every interaction has a rhythm. Some people set the rhythm, others follow it, and the one in control is always the one who is not carried away by it. They're like a still point in a flowing stream. The water may move fast, forcefully, relentlessly, but that still point is not pulled along. And precisely because it is not pulled, it becomes the thing that shapes the flow. In this video, you will not learn how to speak better or react more sharply. You will understand 7 subtle psychological mechanisms where power does not come from doing more, but from stopping the behaviors that quietly make you lose your position. Not to become cold or distant, but to stop being pulled into interactions that are not worth your energy. And when you are no longer being pulled, you will realize something very clearly. You do not need to control others to have power. You only need to stop being controlled by them. Let's begin. 1. Protect your attention like gold. The first principle, and the one that determines everything that follows, is this: your attention is the most valuable asset you own. Not time, because time without focus is almost meaningless. You can have an entire evening free, but if during that time your mind is constantly pulled from one message to another thought, from a small comment to an uncomfortable emotion, then you are not truly living that time. You are simply letting it pass. So what is attention, really? It is not just where your eyes are directed. Attention is where your entire mental energy flows, your thoughts, your emotions, your focus, and your inner state. Simply put, where you place your attention determines the state you are in. If you hold it on clarity, you become clear. If you let it be dragged into confusion, you begin to lose structure within yourself. And the truth is, most of the time, you are not consciously placing your attention. You are reacting. You pick up your phone just to check something briefly, then a message appears. You read it, you think about it, you check again, you wait for a reply, and within minutes, your internal state has shifted. Nothing significant happened, yet you were pulled away. That is how attention gets taken, not loudly, not obviously, but constantly. Look at it in a simpler way. Your attention is like a beam of light in the dark. Whatever you shine it on becomes visible. But if you keep that light there for too long, it does not just become visible, it begins to grow. A small issue can turn into a large story simply because you keep illuminating it. An unstable person can make you unstable simply because you give them too much attention. The problem is not the outside world, but where you are directing your light. That is why those who truly have control are extremely selective. They do not react to everything that appears in front of them. They understand that every moment of attention is an investment. And like any investment, they ask, does this bring value? Is it worth my energy? If not, they let it pass. not because they are cold, but because they do not waste themselves on what is not worth it. Niccolo Machiavelli observed that those who sustain power over time are not the ones who react the fastest, but the ones who maintain their position in the face of small provocations. They do not allow themselves to be pulled into every unnecessary friction because they understand that every reaction is a subtle lowering of their position. Carl Jung expressed it more simply, yet more deeply. What you focus on becomes your reality. Whatever you continuously place your attention on eventually becomes the world you live in. If you constantly focus on uncertainty, you will live in uncertainty. If you constantly focus on others, you will gradually lose yourself. So change does not begin with doing more. It begins with a very small question. Before you respond to a message, before you allow your mind to be pulled into something, pause for a moment and ask, is this worth my attention? Not whether you should be polite, not what others might think, but simply, is this worth it? If the answer is no, you move on. No explanation, no revisiting, no guilt, because every time you keep your attention, you keep your control. And if you do this long enough, something very clear begins to happen. You are no longer being pulled. You begin to choose. And once you begin to choose, you no longer move to someone else's rhythm. You start creating your own. 2. Silence is the sharpest weapon. There is something very strange. People are not truly influenced by what you say. They are influenced far more by what you don't say. But most people never realize this because they are conditioned by a very natural reflex. Whenever something happens, they feel the need to react. Someone says something inaccurate, you want to correct it. Someone misunderstands you, you want to explain. A moment of silence appears, you feel the urge to fill it. And that very reflex is what takes your control away. Think back to a simple situation. Someone says something that slightly touches a nerve. Immediately, a thought appears in your mind, I need to respond. Not because you truly want to speak, but because you cannot tolerate not speaking. And in that exact moment, you've been pulled into the other person's rhythm. You are no longer choosing, you are reacting. That is where power disappears. Not when you say the wrong thing, but when you cannot not speak. Those who truly have control do not operate this way. They do not rush to react, not because they don't know what to say, but because they are not compelled to say anything. They can sit in silence without discomfort, without the need to fill the space, and that silence begins to create something very unusual: pressure. Imagine a conversation like the surface of water. When you keep talking, it's like throwing stones continuously. The surface is always disturbed and no one can see what lies beneath. But when you stop, when you throw nothing more, the water begins to settle. And in that stillness, everything becomes clearer. Silence works the same way. It creates impact not through action, but through the absence of interference. Niccolo Machiavelli observed that those who maintain power over time are not the ones who react to every conflict, but the ones who know when not to engage. They are not pulled into every minor friction because they understand that every reaction lowers their position to the level of the situation. And the moment you have to prove yourself, you are no longer above it. On a deeper level, Carl Jung suggested that what triggers strong reactions in you often reflects the parts within you that are not yet under control. So your inability to remain silent is not about others. It is about your own lack of mastery over your reactions. And that is the real core. When you remain silent in the very moments others expect you to react, something interesting happens. They begin to think more. They wonder what you are thinking. They start adjusting how they speak. You do nothing, yet they begin doing more. Not because you force them, but because human beings are uncomfortable with uncertainty. And silence is what creates that uncertainty. But to do this, you must overcome something very difficult. Not technique, but feeling. The feeling of being misunderstood without correcting it. The feeling of a prolonged silence without filling it. The feeling of not controlling what others think about you and still remaining steady. Most people cannot tolerate this, so they speak. And the moment they speak, they break the advantage that silence just created. Those who truly hold power do not rely on words to maintain their position. They rely on their state. They can remain silent without losing their presence. In fact, their silence makes their presence even more defined. because they are not pulled, not pressured, not in need of proving anything. And in the end, you need to understand something very simple. Silence is not avoidance. It is a choice not to react, a choice not to be carried away, a choice to maintain control without having to do anything at all. And when you can hold that silence long enough, you begin to realize something even deeper. Value does not come from constant presence. Sometimes it is overexposure that makes you invisible. 3. Overexposure diminishes value. There is a paradox that is difficult to notice. The more you make something constantly available, the less it is appreciated. Not because it truly loses value, but because the way humans perceive value is always tied to scarcity. The more accessible something is, the more familiar it becomes, the less attention it receives. And this does not begin with big things. It starts with the small behaviors you repeat every day. You reply to messages instantly. You are always available when others need you. You keep conversations going even when they have already faded. At first, it feels pleasant. It may even make you believe you are building connection. But over time, that presence is no longer felt as value. It becomes expected. And when something becomes expected, people stop seeing it. Think of your presence like a piece of music. A song has highs and lows, rhythm and pauses, and that is why people can feel it. But if the sound plays continuously, without breaks, without silence, it is no longer music. It becomes noise. Presence works the same way. If you are always there, always responding, always filling every gap, you no longer create impact. You become part of the background, something others gradually stop noticing. The issue lies in how human psychology operates. People do not react strongly to what is always available. They react to what they might lose. When you are always there is nothing to lose. And when there is nothing to lose, there is no motivation to hold on. This is not carelessness. It is a very natural mechanism. Carl Jung pointed out that people often do not become aware of the value of something until it is no longer present. This applies not only to emotions, but also to how others perceive you. When you are always there, others no longer feel your presence. They simply get used to it. And once they are used to it, they stop investing attention the way they once did. Niccolo Machiavelli observed this clearly in environments of power. He realized that influence does not come from how often you appear, but from whether your presence creates change. And to create change, that presence cannot be taken for granted. Look at how you are operating. If you are always the one maintaining the conversation, always the one initiating, always the one filling the silence, then you are not just sustaining a connection. You are making that connection entirely dependent on you. And when something exists only because you keep it alive, it is no longer a two-way connection. It becomes a one-sided state that you are carrying. This is why the more you try to show up, the more you begin to feel faded in the eyes of others. Not because you have become less, but because you have become too predictable. And when you are predictable, you lose something essential: curiosity. People are drawn to what they do not fully grasp, not because they enjoy confusion, but because uncertainty forces attention. When you stop replying instantly, when you stop filling every gap, a subtle shift begins to happen. Others start paying more attention. They begin to think more about you. Not because you are doing more, but because you are no longer doing too much. You stop diluting your presence, and in that moment, your value becomes clearer. In the end, you need to understand something very simple. Value is not determined by how often you show up, but by whether your presence makes a difference when you do. And sometimes what makes you more valuable is not appearing more, but knowing when not to appear. And when you begin to do that, you will realize something even deeper. Not all attention is experienced as positive. Sometimes your attention itself becomes pressure. 4. Excessive care creates invisible pressure. There is something very few people realize. Giving more care does not always mean it will be received positively. Sometimes your care itself becomes pressure, and this does not happen in an obvious way. It unfolds quietly, so subtly that you do not even notice where things begin to go wrong. You text a little more, you check in a little more, you try a little harder to maintain the connection, the closeness, the other person's emotional state. Just a bit more. All of it comes from good intentions. But on the other side, it no longer feels the same. They no longer experience it as care. They begin to feel surrounded by something with no room to breathe. The problem is not that you are doing something wrong. The problem is that you are doing too much. Think of care like sunlight. A little warmth feels comforting, pleasant, but if you stand under the sun for too long, without shade, without a break, that feeling changes. You no longer enjoy it, you start wanting to escape it. Not because sunlight is bad, but because it has no limit. Care works the same way. When it has no stopping point, it stops feeling comforting and begins to feel like pressure. People need space, not because they want to move away from you, but because they need to preserve a sense of freedom within themselves. When your care begins to fill that space, they no longer feel at ease, and their natural response is to pull back, not because they dislike you, but because they need to restore balance within their own state. Carl Jung once said that anything pushed too far creates an opposing force. Emotions are no exception. When you pour too much energy into someone, you are not just giving, you are unintentionally creating a force that compels them to adjust, and the most common adjustment is distance. This is where many people fail to see clearly. When they sense the other person pulling away, they do not stop, they do more. They message more, care more, try harder. But the more they do, the further they push the other person away. Not because they lack value, but because they are creating pressure they themselves cannot see. Niccolò Machiavelli observed that in any system of power, when one side pushes too hard, the system naturally generates an opposing force to restore balance. This is not limited to politics. It exists in every human interaction. The more you try to hold on, the more the other person tends to move away, not because they want to leave, but because they need to regain control of how they feel. Look at the small patterns. You are always the one starting the conversation. You are always the one sustaining it. You are always the one filling the silence. It may look like initiative, but from another angle, you are not allowing space to exist. And when there is no space, the other person has no room to step in. The connection slowly becomes one-sided, and you are the one carrying it. Those who truly have control do not operate this way. They do not give more to keep a relationship. They give in proportion. They know when to stop, when to step back, when to allow space to appear. Not because they are indifferent, but because they understand that space is not disconnection. Space is where connection begins to form from the other side. In the end, you need to understand 5. Remove what is not worthy. Have you ever noticed there are people who don't really bring anything into your life, yet you still keep them there? Not because they matter, but because you're used to them. You're used to their presence, used to the responses, used to having a connection, even if that connection is unclear, shallow, and sometimes even draining. And that sense of familiarity is what keeps you stuck. Human beings have a very particular tendency. They don't hold on to what is valuable. They hold on to what they've invested in. You've spent time on someone, so it's hard to let go. You've gotten used to talking every day, so you keep going. You once felt a connection, so you hope it's still there. But the problem is, present value does not come from the past. It comes from what is actually happening now. Face this directly. There are people who are not doing anything wrong, but they are not bringing anything right either. They don't make you better. They don't make you clearer. They don't move you forward. Yet they remain taking up a portion of your attention, your energy, your space. And the dangerous part is you don't realize you are being held back. Imagine your life as a room. Every person you keep is an object inside that room. If you keep too many unnecessary things, the room becomes crowded. There's no space for anything new, no room to move, no clarity, and you begin to feel suffocated without knowing why. Carl Jung once said that a person cannot become their next self if they are still holding tightly to what belongs to their old self. This is not only true for thoughts, but also for relationships. What is no longer aligned, if you continue to hold it, it will hold you back. This is where many people get stuck. They think letting go is losing. But in reality, holding on to the wrong things is the real loss. You lose clarity, you lose energy, you lose the opportunity for better things to enter your life. Niccolò Machiavelli viewed power very clearly. Anything that does not serve your position, if you keep it, will gradually pull you down to its level. There is no such thing as keeping without impact. Everything you allow to remain is influencing you. Those who truly have control do not keep every relationship. They choose. They know exactly who deserves their attention, who deserves their time, and most importantly, who does not. This does not mean becoming cold or cutting everything off. It simply means you stop giving unconsciously. You stop maintaining unclear connections. You stop sustaining interactions that bring no value. You stop returning to what no longer fits. At first, this will feel difficult, not because you don't know what to do, but because you are used to it, used to their presence, used to that rhythm, used to having something, even if you're not sure what it is. But when you begin to pause, something very clear happens. Space appears. You feel lighter, clearer, and you begin to see things you couldn't see before because they were being filled. In the end, you need to understand something very simple. You cannot hold on to everything and still move forward. There are things that only when you let go can you continue. And when you begin to remove what is not worthy, you will realize something even. 6. Stopping is not losing. It is resetting your position. There is a very common misunderstanding that when you stop, when you are no longer initiating, no longer pursuing, no longer trying to hold things together, you are losing something. But in reality, it is often the opposite. You are not losing. You are simply stopping yourself from remaining in a lower position within an interaction that had already become unbalanced without you realizing it. Most people, when they sense a shift in a relationship, have an instinct to do more. They send another message, try to keep the conversation going, attempt to pull things back to how they were. They think it is effort, care, responsibility. But if you look closely, most of these actions do not come from clarity. They come from fear. Fear of losing the connection, fear of losing the person, fear of losing the familiar feeling they once had. And when your actions come from fear, they always place you in a position of chasing. Imagine that every relationship has an invisible scale. Each time you initiate, each time you maintain the rhythm, each time you fill the silence, that scale tilts toward you. At first, the shift is small, almost unnoticeable. But over time, when one person consistently does more, the other naturally does less. Not because they intend to, but because the system balances itself in that direction. And eventually, you realize that you are the one carrying the entire rhythm while the other only responds when they feel like it. That is when you begin to feel exhausted, yet you try even harder. And that effort only exposes the imbalance more clearly. Because when you have to constantly do something to maintain a relationship, you are no longer in control. You're in maintenance mode. This is where stopping becomes something entirely different. It is not giving up. It is recalibrating. When you stop initiating messages, stop carrying the conversation, stop filling unnatural gaps, you are not just ceasing action. You are changing the rhythm of the entire interaction. And when the rhythm changes, the balance finally has a chance to shift back. Niccolo Machiavelli viewed power as a matter of position, not action. The one with position is not the one who does more, but the one who is not forced to act. And when you are constantly acting just to hold something together, you have already left that position without realizing it. In contrast, when you can stop without panic, you begin to return to your center. Something very interesting happens when you truly stop. If the relationship has real value, if the other person is genuinely invested, they will feel the space. They will begin to adjust, to initiate more, to move toward you. Not because you asked, but because balance is being restored. But if nothing happens, if everything remains silent, then that too is a very clear answer. You have not lost anything. You have simply seen more clearly what was already there. Carl Jung emphasized that people often stay busy to avoid facing the truth. In relationships, it is the same. Sometimes you keep acting not to maintain something, but to avoid seeing that it is no longer what you thought it was. Stopping forces you to confront that truth. And that is why it feels difficult. Not because it is wrong, but because it reveals something you may not yet be ready to accept. Yet it is precisely this act of stopping that frees you. When you no longer chase, no longer try to hold, no longer force things to remain as they were, you return to your position. You do not need to do more to be in control. You simply need to stop doing the things that make you lose control. In the end, understand this clearly. Stopping is not losing, it is how you test reality. What comes back to you has value. What disappears was never truly yours. And once you understand this, you no longer fear stopping. You begin to use it as a way to regain control instead of seeing it as surrender. And from that point, you enter a very different state, one where you no longer need to be chosen. Yet that is exactly when you become the one who is chosen. 7, the one who does not chase becomes the one who is chosen, fewer. There is a paradox that, if you haven't experienced it, is very hard to believe. The more someone tries to be chosen, the less they are chosen. And the one who no longer tries to chase becomes the one others begin to move toward. Most people live in a very familiar state. They want recognition, they want to be kept, they want to be seen as important. And from that desire, they begin to act. They try to show more, care more, maintain the connection, secure their place in the eyes of others. But there is something they don't realize. The more they try to be chosen, the more they place themselves in a lower position, because their actions no longer come from wholeness, they come from need. And need always reveals itself. You may not say it out loud, but the way you react, the way you maintain the rhythm, the way you cannot stop, all of it sends a very clear signal: I need this. And in every interaction, the one who needs more is the one who loses position, not because they are less, but because they are more dependent. In contrast, the one who does not chase is not someone who does not care. They simply do not depend. They can connect without needing to hold on at all costs. They can care without losing themselves in it. They can stay, but they are also ready to leave when things no longer align. And it is precisely this ability not to need that creates something entirely different: attraction. Imagine two people. One is always trying to keep you, always present, always responding, always doing everything to make sure you don't leave. The other does none of that. They don't disappear, but they don't cling. They don't try to control. They don't try to hold. They simply exist in a very natural way. Who draws your attention more? Not the one who does more, but the one who is not carried away by you. Carl Jung once said that true attraction comes from an individual who is internally complete, not seeking external validation to feel whole. When you are no longer seeking, you no longer signal lack, and that is what makes others perceive you as valuable. Niccolo Machiavelli viewed power in a similar way. The one who maintains position is not the one who chases to sustain attention, but the one who is not dependent on being noticed. When you do not need recognition, you cannot be controlled by it. This is the point where everything shifts. When you no longer try to be chosen, you begin to choose. You no longer ask, am I enough? You begin to ask, is this aligned with me? You no longer try to hold everything. You begin to observe what is truly worthy of staying. And when you move from a state of needing to a state of choosing, your entire position changes. You no longer chase. You become the point others must move toward. Not because you try to create that effect, but because you stop doing the things that diminish your value. In the end, understand this clearly. You cannot chase and be attractive at the same time. They move in opposite directions. One comes from lack, the other comes from wholeness. And when you truly stop chasing, not as a strategy, but because you no longer need to, you enter a completely different state, a state where you are no longer trying to be chosen. Yet at that very moment, you become someone others cannot easily ignore. There are people who try to speak more in order to be heard, yet no one truly pays attention. And there are others who barely need to say anything, yet their presence creates impact. The difference is not in communication skills, not in how they express themselves, but in the inner position they hold. When you look back at this entire journey, you begin to see something very clearly. You don't lose power because you are not good enough. You lose power because you've become accustomed to reacting. You react to messages, react to emotions, react to changes in others. And every time you react without choice, you unconsciously give away a part of your control. But when you begin to pause, to become selective, to hold distance at the right moments, everything changes. Not because you become colder, but because you are no longer being pulled. You no longer need to hold everything together, no longer need to fill every silence, no longer need to prove your worth. And in that moment, you begin to return to your center. What matters most is not how many techniques you learn, but whether you understand the nature of it. Real power does not come from doing more. It comes from stopping the behaviors that cause you to lose position. You do not need to control others. You only need to stop letting them control your state. Some things will fall away when you stop, but that is not loss. It is clarity. Anything that requires you to chase in order to keep it was never truly yours. And anything that truly has value does not need to be forced. It will find its way to stay. In the end, you will realize something very simple, yet very difficult. When you stop chasing, stop reacting, stop trying to hold everything together, you do not become weaker. You become harder to reach. And when you're no longer easy to reach, you are no longer easy to control. That is when real power begins.